Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. I am Muhammad Abu Bakr, and in this video we shall be solving the Cambridge O-level physics. Finally, we have started the paper 2, which is the theory paper, and we are doing this from the May-June 2023 session. Question paper number 21, variant 21. So this paper 2 is the theory paper in which you have to write much, and it's completely different from the MCQ paper. So, and this is the first video of my YouTube channel on the theory papers of O levels. So let's start our video. So question number 1 is: an aircraft pulls a glider along a runway as shown in figure 1.1. Okay, so an aircraft pulls a glider along a runway. So this aircraft, it is attached to this glider here. It is attached to this glider, and this, when as soon as this aircraft starts to move up in the air, glider again runs with it, and it also starts to move up in the air. So figure 1.2 shows the speed of the glider during the first 12 seconds of the motion. So the speed is on the x-axis and the time is on the y-axis. Time is on the x and speed is on the y. So describe the motion of the glider in the first 12 seconds. Now what will happen here? Now you can clearly see from the graph here, during the first 6 seconds, the slope this slope shows us that this body is accelerating. Its speed is accelerating, its speed is increasing, and that's why it would be accelerating during the first 6 seconds. And this is a straight line graph which obeys the linear law y is equal to mx plus c. So what does this mean? This means that this is constant acceleration. This is constant acceleration. During the first 6 seconds there is constant acceleration, and after that, what happens after that? After that, the speed becomes constant. The body is moving, but the speed becomes constant k in the next 6 seconds. So that's the motion of the glider in the first 12 seconds. So now I'm gonna write here that there is uniform acceleration. There is uniform acceleration. So you can see in the graph that there is uniform acceleration because the slope is there is uniform because slope is straight line. There is uniform acceleration for the first 6 seconds, and after that, what happens after that? The speed remains the same. There is not any acceleration, the body is still moving, and after that the glider travels at a constant speed. So that's your answer, sir. So question B part: in the first 6 seconds of the motion, there is a resultant force of 1800 newtons on the glider. There's a resultant force of 1800 newtons on the glider. Using the increase in speed in the first 6 seconds, calculate the mass of the glider. Now in the first 6 seconds, the resultant force acting is 1800 newton. The resultant force acting is 1800 newtons, and now I have to calculate the mass of the glider. So I will simply use the formula F is equal to ma here. So first of all, I will, and now he has said that you have to calculate the increase in speed in the first 6 seconds, and then you will obviously figure out the mass of the glider. So the acceleration during the first 6 seconds, what is acceleration? Acceleration is equal to v minus u divided by t, where v is the final velocity and u is the initial velocity. The final velocity here is something like I think it is 22. Yes, it is. So 22 2 minus the initial velocity 0 and I divide it by times 6. So the answer is something about 22 divided by 6. So the answer is 3.66. So the acceleration is 3.66. So now I put the values F over A, I will get the M. The force acting here on the glider is 1800 newtons, which causes this acceleration. So I divide 1800 by 3.67 to get the mass. 1800 divided by the answer. 490 is the answer here. 490 is the answer. 490 is the mass of the glider here. 490 kg. 490 kg is the mass of the glider. So question number C, determine the distance traveled by the glider in the first 6 seconds of its motion. Now this is a speed time graph. Now either you can calculate the distance traveled during the first 6 seconds by using the area under graph. You can use the area under graph, which is this triangle, or you can simply use the second equation of motion. So you can use either the second equation of motion or you can use the area under graph, but I will simply use the second equation of motion, which is distance travel uh, is equal to ut plus half at square. The initial velocity is 0 here, so 0 into time, that will become 0. Acceleration is 3.67. The time is 6 seconds, I guess. Yes, it is. The time is 6 seconds, and 6 squares is equal to 36, and I divide this by 2. So I multiply 36 by 3.67, so that is 131.76, and I divide this by 2, divide the answer by 2, so I will get 65.9, 65.9, which is approximately equals to 66 meters. So that's your answer. Question number D. So the glider has no engine and stays in the air with the use of convection current. State what is meant by the convection current. So what is convection current? Convection current is the circulation of air. The circulation of air currents mainly due to the temperature differences, and as a result the hot air, which is the less dense air, rises upwards, and this later on helps obviously the glider to move. So a convection current, I'm gonna write it here. So a convection current a convection current is the circulation. The circulation is the movement of air currents, the movement, the circulation of air currents due to temperature differences, and this temperature differences later on helps the body to move. So that's your answer. So now suggest how the convection current suppo- that supports the glider is formed. So again, a convection current is formed because of the temperature differences. As a result, less dense air rises upward. What is less dense air? Which is hot air. So hot air. So I had write here hot air from chimneys, or you can say the factories, kilns, from the hot air. Hot air from chimneys, factories, thermal power stations all contribute. Thermal power stations, mm, car engines rises upwards, which is less dense air that helps the glider move. So that's your answer. Hot air from the chimneys, from the factories, from the thermal power station, the car engines, or you can say any object which is emitting hot air. It rises upwards. It is less dense, and that's why a convection current is formed that helps the glider move. So that's your answer to question number one. So we move on. Question number two is now in a safety test, a car of mass 1100 kg travels at a speed of 10 meters per second and collides with a stationary van of mass 3000 kg. After the collision, the car and the mass and the van move together with the velocity v. Figure 2.1 shows the car and the van before and after the collision. Okay, so the total momentum of the car is conserved during the. So now, what this is the important thing here? The total momentum. Now he has said that the total momentum of the car is conserved here, means that the law of conservation of momentum can be applied here. So first of all, he asks you what is momentum. Momentum is the quantity. Momentum momentum is mhm. Momentum is the quantity of motion a body possesses due to its mass and velocity. Velocity. So, and you can write the formula here. Momentum is equal to mass multiply velocity of the body. State the unit of momentum. Mass has a unit of kg. Velocity is taken in kg meters per second. So, sorry. Velocity is taken in meters per second. So the unit of momentum is kg meters per second, or you can simply write Newton seconds, which is equivalent to kg meters per second. So part B, calculate the velocity v of the car and the van after the collision. Now what is the important thing here? The total momentum of the car and the van is conserved, means that the momentum this system possesses here is equal to the momentum this system possesses after the collision remains the same. So initially the momentum here is, so I'm gonna write here is momentum of initially is, so what is momentum? Momentum is the product of both momentum here, momentum initial before collision, I mean, is the conjugate, is the addition value, is the total value of the momentum both this van and the car possess. This van has zero momentum because its velocity is zero, and this car has momentum only. So the initial momentum would only be 1100 multiplied 10 meters per second. So I will get 11,000 kg per meters second, or you can ignore the units as well. So the initial momentum is 11,000, and this initial momentum should be equal to the final momentum. So in the final momentum, both the car and the van both move because the car initiates the motion of the van. So they both will have momentum here. Their mass is their total mass would be 4100 here. Their masses would be 4100, and now I have to calculate the velocity. Now you can take both this car and the van as a single object because they both are in contact, and this car is exerting a force on this van, so they both become a single subject. And you can take them as a single object which is moving, which consists of two parts. So their mass here is 4100 kg, and I multiplied this by something which is called the velocity, and this velocity here, it is the velocity of both the van and the car. Simply, if I have to find the velocity, now I know the initial momentum is equal to the final momentum, so it is 11,000 here. I divide this by 4100 here, so I will get the velocity of the car and the van, both the car and the van. So these are the catchwords here, both the car and the van. So 11,000, you do the maths, 11,000 divided by 4100, so you will get 2.68 meters per second. 2.68 meters per second is the velocity here. Okay, you can write 2.7 meters per second. So that's your answer. So now C, calculate the total kinetic energy of the car and the van after the collision. So the total kinetic energy of this whole system, it would be half mv square. So kinetic energy is equal to half mv square. So the mass of both the object is 4100, and the velocity is 2.68 squared. So multiply this by 4100 divided by 2. So 14,723.925. So the kinetic energy is 14,723.925 joules, or you can write as 147. You can write 14730 joules, or you can further reduce it to significant figures. So, but that's your answer. So the last C, the second part of C, state the transfer of energy that occurs in the collision. What happens during the collision? Some heat would escape here, and the kinetic energy of this car would be transferred to this van, and that causes the van to move as well. So I can write here the car transfers its the car the car transfers its energy to the van. This is the kinetic energy to the van, and some energy is dissipated as heat. So that's your answer. Question number 2. That's the end. Question number 3 here. Figure 3.1 shows a circuit containing three resistors, a 12-volt power supply, and an ammeter. 12 watts power supply. Okay, this is the ammeter here. Calculate the current in the 400 ohms resistor. Now what will happen here? The current would flow in this direction. There is resistor 1, resistor 2, and then the resistor 3. and I have to find the current which is present at this point. So the total resistance, the current faces after moving through the 400 ohms resistor would not only be this R3, it would also be this R2, it would also be this R1 because the current is flowing in this direction. R1 and R2 also oppose the motion of the current, and then the current passes through the third resistor, and afterwards you calculate the current. So by Ohm's law you have V is equal to IR, so V over R is equal to I, but this R here is not only the 400 ohms, it is 700 ohms, which is the addition of all the resistances. So 12 divided by 700, so that is 0.017 amperes. That's the answer. So question number 3A. Question number 3B. Calculate the power produced in the 400 ohms resistor. So power, you have the formula P is equal to VI. The voltage is 12 volts, and I multiply this by 0.017. Multiply this by 0.017. 12 into 0.017. So I am mistaken here. The voltage here won't be 12. Now the the resistors here also reduce the voltage which is responsible for producing the current in the 400 ohm resistor. So first of all, I will have to find the voltage which is equal to I3 over R3. This is the R3, and I also call this I3. So no, V is equal to IR, so I multiply the both. So I multiply 400 with 0.017 to calculate the voltage flowing through the third resistor, which is the R3. So V3 would be equal to 6.8 something. We call this 6.8, and then I multiply 6.8 with 0.017. Then I will get the power to multiply with the 0.017. So you will get 0.015115. So 0.12 watt approximately is the power produced in the 400 ohms resistor. Question number 3, C part. Question number 3, C part. A student uses all of the components shown in the figure 3.1 in another circuit. Okay, so I can see here. So all the components remain the same. She connects that so that there is the largest possible current in each resistor. The current in one of the resistors is larger than the current in the two resistor. Students connect the ammeter circuit to measure the current in this resistor. Draw the circuit diagram of the arrangement. Label each resistor with the value of the resistors. So first of all, you will have to put a power supply here. So this is the 12 volt. It will remain the same, and this would be a parallel arrangement. Why this would be the parallel arrangement? Because he says that there is the largest possible current in each resistor. In the series, the 100 ohm resistor lowers the amount of current passing through the R2, and this R2 and R1 lower the current passing through the R3. So if I connect them in the series, then there would be the largest possible current in the each resistor, because none of the resistor has the effects on the current passing through the other resistor. So I will have to connect them in the parallel, and she connects them, so there is the largest possible current in each resistor, and the current in one of the resistor is larger than the current in the other two resistors. So all the three resistances are attached here. And in these three resistances, one has the largest value of current passing through it. R1 has a resistance of 100 ohms, so definitely it will have most current. So this is the 100 ohm resistor, this is the 200 ohm resistor, and this is the 400 ohm resistor. And then he attaches an ammeter into the circuit to measure the largest current in the resistor in this resistor. So I attach an ammeter here. The current would flow in this direction. So there is largest possible current in the 100 ohm resistor. So that's your answer. Question number 3. All is done. Question number 4. A student pushes a drawing pin into a wooden board in figure 4.1. The area of the pin in contact with the finger is 5 into 10 raised to power negative 5 meters square. The student pushes downward with the force of 26 Newton. The mass of the drawing pin is very small. Calculate the pressure exerted by the finger on the drawing pin. So the pressure exerted by the finger on the drawing pin here, on the drawing pin. So pressure is equal to force per unit area. So you do the maths here. 26 divided by 5.0 into 10 raised to power negative 5. So that is 5,20,000 pascals, or you can write 520 kilopascals. So question number 2, compare the force exerted by the finger on the drawing pin with the force exerted by the drawing pin on the wooden board. Now some of you might confuse here because the area of contact here, the area is lower here and the area is greater here. Then you would say the pressure here, pressure of the drawing pin on the wooden board is greater. But he asks you to compare the force. He doesn't even ask you to talk about the area, talk about the pressure, talk about any other thing nonsense. So he also only asks you to compare the force. So the force will definitely remain the same. There is not any resistance here. The force which this finger applies on this drawing pin will be carried as the force which the drawing pin applies on this wooden board. So that's what you have to do. So the force exerted by the finger on the drawing pin and the wooden board, the forces will be same. That's your answer. So question number 3, explain why the drawing pin, explain why the drawing pin goes into the wooden board but not into the finger. Why the drawing pin goes into the wooden board, not into the finger. Now what is the reason here? The drawing pin won't go into the finger because finger has greater area of contact here. Finger has greater area of contact here, and this wooden board here has lower area of contact. It has lower area of contact, and the surface of the finger is also not uniform. So I had say that the larger pressure is on the wooden board, and that's why the drawing piece goes into the wooden board, and there's lower pressure on the finger. That's why it doesn't go through it, although it can go through it. So I write the answer. There is there is there is a larger pressure exerted on the wooden board by the drawing pin because the area is lower, and you know that lower is the area, greater is the pressure in comparison to the finger, and also the surface of finger is not uniform. so it cannot penetrate. So that's your answer to question number 2 or question number 4, sorry. Question number 4b. So now it is still remaining. Okay. Figure 4.2 shows the water emerging from a plastic bag that contains a small number of holes. Explain why the water emerges from each hole in the direction at right angles to the surface of the bag. So, this is a simple question actually. Now he asks us why the water emerges from the each hole in the direction at right angles to the surface. The pressure exerts like in this way the pressure is exerted in this way, and the pressure and pressure in this way, and the force acts perpendicularly to the surface of the bag. The force acts perpendicularly to the surface of the bag, and that's the reason why the pressure always exerts in all directions. Now, if I again revise, no, I can write here, and then obviously you will revise here as well. The pressure acts in all. The pressure acts in all directions because the force exerted by the water is perpendicular perpendicular to the force is perpendicular to the surface of the bag. The force is always perpendicular to the surface of a bag when there is water pressure in a closed container, and that's why the pressure acts in all directions, and it is a testament to the Pascal's law to the surface of bag. That's your answer. So now part 2, the holes at A and B are the same size. So explain why the water emerges faster from hole at A and then at the hole at B. Now the formula for water pressure is rho gh. A is at a greater height and B is at a lower height. The height is in the downwards direction. So A experiences greater water pressure, B experiences lower water pressure. So I can write here A ex- experiences greater water pressure in comparison to B. Why? Because because it is at greater depth, and it and it is no, that's only the answer. Because it is at greater depth, it experiences greater water pressure, and this greater water pressure is responsible why water emerges through A faster than in comparison to B. So that's your answer here. So question number 5. Figure 5.1 show the particles in the sample of a liquid water. Explain using the ideas about particles why the liquids expand more for the same temperature rise. It's a pretty simple question here. Now, I had right here liquids have less liquids liquids have less forces of attraction, and when energy here means the temperature. When energy is provided, these forces are easily overcome, and as a result they expand more in comparison to solids which have strong intra and intermolecular forces. So that's your answer. Liquids have less forces of attraction. The liquids have more energy than the gases, but they have less energy than the liquids. And to overcome this attraction, temperature, or you can say the energy, is provided, and the liquid molecules are separated from each other. Their intermolecular forces are broken down, and as a result, they expand more than the solids. So, question B: the boiling point of water is 100 degrees C. State the boiling point of the water on the Kelvin scale of temperature. So, you simply add 273 here. So, you will get 373 Kelvins here. So, part B: to the temperature remains constant as water turns from liquid to gas at the boiling point, spinning in terms of the particles. Why energy must be provided even though the temperature stays constant? Why is energy provided at the boiling point? At a boiling point, a liquid turns into the gas. Again, energy is needed to overcome the intermolecular forces of the liquid, and when there is more than enough breakdown of the intermolecular forces of the liquid turns into the gas, it vaporizes, and that's the point at the boiling point. So even if you do not provide a temperature, you have to provide the energy there, and if the energy is there, a point will come when the liquid will completely convert into the gas. So I will simply write here that energy is still, you can say, required to overcome the, I'm writing IMF here, it is not the International Monetary Fund, it is the intermolecular forces. It required to overcome the intermolecular forces of the liquid as it turns into a gas which is less at energy, or you can say stability. Gases have less intermolecular forces than the liquids, and they are less stable as well. So that's your answer. C, part C: an electric heater is used to heat a sample of metal as shown in figure 5.2. There is no thermal energy transfer from the metal to the surroundings during the heating. The metal has a mass of 200 kg and is initially at 515 degrees C. The heater is switched on for 2 minutes and then switched off. The maximum temperature is 40 degrees C. The power of the heater is 20 watts. Calculate the specific heat capacity of the metal. Show your working. So you have to do complete steps here. So formula for the heat, for the specific heat capacity, is Q is equal to mc delta T. So now mm, so Q is equal to mc delta D. Now I have to find the value of C. So let me change the colors, please. So now we are not directly provided the energy here. We are being provided the power of the heater. So if I divide this by time on both of the sides, it will not make any difference. and energy divided by time becomes power. So I will write 20 watts here. The mass is 200 kgs, which is zero point 0.2 kg. C will remain same. The temperature difference is 40 minus 15 degrees C, or you can convert it to the Kelvin scale as well. It's 40 minus 15, that is 25 degrees C. And the time is 2 minutes. You do not have to write a 2 minutes, you have to write 120 seconds. Seconds is the SI unit. So be careful of that. So you will get 240 watts here divided by zero point 0.2 into 25, which is equal to C 225. So 0.48 joule per kilogram centigrade is the specific heat capacity. Oh, okay. So I see you have to calculate the units of grams. So in the units of grams, I divide this by. I have to calculate in grams. 0.48. You have 200. You have 200 grams here, so you can put 200 here as well. So mm, 200 grams to 120, so 240 divided by 200 into 25. The specific heat capacity, the answer is equal to 0.48 joules per gram centigrade. The joules per gram centigrade is your answer. You have 2400 here, and you divide this by 200 and minus 25, and temperature, which is temperature difference, which is 25 degrees C. So you will get specific heat capacity SHC. That's your answer, joules per gram centigrade. So that's the end of question number 5. Question number 6 here. The virtual reality headset in figure 6.1 contains a display and a lens as shown in figure 6.2. Okay, display, the virtual reality headset is the display, the lens and the eyes. The display is the object for the lens, so this is the object. The lens acts as a magnifying glass and forms a virtual image of the display. Describe where the display must be positioned relative to the focal length of the lens for the lens to act as a magnifying glass. So when does, so now you revise your concepts here. When does a lens act as a magnifying glass? You know, it only acts as a magnifying glass when the object is placed inside its focal length, within its focal length. So it acts as a magnifier, checks as a magnifier when only when an object is placed within its focal length. So if this lens acts as a magnifier, then suppose this is the focal length, or you can say this is the focal length, and this display which acts as an object, it must be placed within the focal length. It must be placed within the focal length so that it acts as so that the lens acts as a magnifying glass and forms a virtual image. So that's only the condition you have to satisfy. Explain how a virtual image is formed. A virtual image is formed when the image appears to come from back of the mirror, the and appear to converge at a point from back of the mirror, but they actually do not converge actually. So mm, a virtual image is formed when rays followed behind the mirror converge at a at a point and converge at a point and appear to come from back of the, or you can say the other side of the mirror, that would be better. Other side of the mirror. The best example of a virtual image is the plane mirror in the barber shop. It is the best example. So a virtual image is formed when the rays of the light appear to come from back of the points, not by actual converging, but they appear to converge at the point. So that's your answer. Part B. This looks quite tricky. An arrow on the display. An arrow on the display is 3.4 centimeters from the length. The virtual image of the arrow is 22 centimeters from the lens. Figure 6.3 shows the arrow, the lens, and the virtual image of the arrow eyes. This is the virtual image, this is the object, and this is the lens, obviously, drawn on a grid with the scale of 1:2. So ignore the scale for some time. Ignore the scale for some time. After all, you have to take the scale into consideration. On figure 6.3, draw a ray diagram to show the formation of the virtual image. Now, first of all, the ray passing through the optical center, remains undeviated. After that, the ray parallel to principal axis then deviates. It converges. So it is a, and these rays do not actually meet. It is a virtual image is formed here. Why the virtual image is formed here? Because this object O is again placed, suppose this is the focal length, is again placed within the focal length of the object. So that's the main thing you have to put your focus on. An object will work as a magnifying glass only when it's placed, and a lens will only act as a magnifying glass only when it is placed, only when an object is placed within its focal length. And these rays, if you check here, these rays will converge at this point, so that a highly magnified, multiple times magnified image is formed here. A highly magnified image is formed at this point. So now you have drawn, my drawing is quite rough here. You have to draw it properly, neatly, according to scale. So but that's how you will do this. So now determine the focal length of the lens. Now the ray passing through the optical center remains undeviated, so you can ignore this for some time. And then if you check here, the ray passing the principal axis passes through this point here. It passes through this point here. So this must be the focal length of the lens. This must be focal length of the lens. For this to act as focal length, you have to take the scale into account. So one, one, two, three, four, five. Five boxes means 2 centimeters. So you have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. So you have 10 boxes in total. So you will get 4 centimeters here. So the focal length of the lens is 4 centimeters. Question number 7. So question number 7. A water wave in a ripple tank diffracts as it passes through the gap in the barrier. Figure 7.1 shows the drawing made by the student of the crests in the pattern. So state one way in which the student's drawing of the crest is wrong. So definitely you have seen the student has increased the wavelength here. He has increased the wavelength. The wavelength remains constant during the diffraction. This diffraction, it is passing through a slit. So ideally the wavelength should remain the same. So the student has altered the wave length of the student here has now altered the wavelength. So this is a water wave, altered the wavelength of the water wave. So that's the mistake he has done here. So part B, the gap in the barrier is now made smaller than the wavelength as shown in figure 7.2. So complete figure 7.2 with at least 3 crests to show the new diffraction pattern. So the wavelengths of first thing remain the same. Now you have decreased the area, you have decreased the slit here. So you will get greater diffraction here. So it would be something like this or something like this or something like this. You at least have to draw the 3, so I think I should draw it properly here. So it would be 1. So take care of the wavelength here. You have to take care of the wavelength 2 and 3. So that would be the pattern, I guess. I think I am again something wrong. I'm something doing wrong here. So this drawing looks something strange to me, but it is not actually. So the complete drawing would be like this. So now I satisfy my answer. So take care of the wavelength. I cannot write properly on my computer. So that's your answer. Part C. In one part of the ripple tank, the water wave has a speed of 6 centimeters per second and a wavelength of 2 centimeters. The wave then passes into the shallow region of the tank. The speed of the wave in the shallow region is 4 centimeters per second. Define the term wavelength. What is wavelength? The it is the distance. It is the distance between two adjacent crests or troughs, whatever you take, is the wavelength. Calculate the frequency of the wave. For you have formula V is equal to F lambda. So V over lambda, you will get the F. The velocity is 6 centimeters per second. Ignore the units. 6, and I divide this by 2. So the frequency would be 3 hertz. And calculate the wavelength of the wave in the shallow part of the tank. Now during this experiment the frequency would remain the same. So now V is equal to F lambda V over F. So V over F, the frequency is to F lambda. So V over F, the speed of the wave in the shallow region is 4 centimeters, and you have to calculate the wavelength again in the shallow part of the tank. So 4 by 3, so the wavelength would be equal to 1.3 centimeters. That's your answer to question number 7. Question number 8. A filament lamp is arranged above a shiny metal surface as shown. So a student reads in a textbook that an LED is more efficient than a filament lamp. State what is meant by efficiency. Now, if you the exact definition is that the efficiency is defined as the total amount of output acquired from a total amount of energy input to a machine or a appliance. The ratio of output to the input is called the efficiency of that appliance. So the total energy given as output, if it is equal to the total energy given to it as input, then the appliance is 100% efficient. So efficiency is the ratio of energy obtained from the system as output to the total energy given to it as input. So suggest why the efficiency of filament lamp is very low. The filament lamp, a lot of energy is dissipated as heat from the filament lamp. So if you simply write it as well, it's enough. A lot of energy, a lot of energy is dissipated from the filament lamp as heat, and that's the reason, that's why it has lower efficiency. So part B, the student considers replacing the filament lamp shown in the figure 8.1 with an LED of same brightness. Data about the filament lamp and a suitable LED are shown on the table. So the LED emits the same amount of visible light as the filament lamp. Using this confirmation and the data in table 8.1, determine the efficiency of the LED. The LED emits the same amount of visible light as the filament lamp. So if you put another column of output here, so they both have the same output. The output is same for both. Now the efficiency of filament lamp is 6.2%. To calculate the output, you multiply FEC efficiency, I'm writing it FEC, with the input, and you have to take the efficiency in, not in percentage, you have to take it in numerics. So you multiply 0.62 with 120. So you, no, sorry, you divide 120 with 6.2. So yeah, this is the formula for output efficiency multiply input. The efficiency in numerics would be equal to 0.062, not 0.62. I had mistaken here, and I multiply this with the input power. So the output here is 7.44. So this output is the amount of visible light the filament lamp generates, and this is also the output of the LED. Now I have to calculate the efficiency of the LED. So I have got the output, I have got the input. So you take 7.5, 7.44, that's 7.5, and divide this by 15. So you will get 50. The efficiency is 50%. So that's your answer. Part C, the filament lamp is connected to the live and neutral wires in the mains supply. The earth wire in the main supply is connected to the shiny metal surface as shown. Okay, in figure 8.1 there's a fuse in a live wire. By accident the live wire touches the shiny metal surface. Describe what then happens. Now as soon as the live wire will touch this shiny metal surface, the current would start flowing through it, and the earth wire in the main supply is connected to the shiny metal surface, and there's also an earth wire here, and this current is earth here. There is an earth wire, so this earth wire will earth the current here, so what will happen here is that as soon as the live wire touches the shiny metal surface, the current will be earthed. But also the fuse will blow away, because when a large amount of current passes to the earth wire, the fuse will also blow away. So I can write here is that current flows to the current flows to the earth, and the fuse will also blow as soon as the live wire allows the current to pass through the shiny metal surface, and the fuse will also blow. So that that will happen here in this case. The fuse will blow, the current flows to the earth, and there won't be any more current passing through any of the wires, because the fuse breaks the circuit, the wires. That's your answer. So in another similar lamp, the fuse is wrongly connected into the earth wire. Explain why a person is not protected when the live wire touches a shiny metal surface. Now the fuse is wrongly connected to the earth wire, so there is a, you can say, the fuse is here. The fuse is here. I call this F. The fuse is here, and when the live wire touches the shiny metal surface, the live wire touch the shiny metal surface here. So see what will happen here. So there is a fuse here, but there is not any fuse on the live wire and the neutral wire. So when the live wire, when the LV touches this shiny metal surface, the current will start flowing in it, and when the current will start flowing through it, the fuse will still blow, because fuse is not sustainable to the amount of current passing through the earth wire. But because the live wire is in constant touch with the earth wire, the current will still flow through it, and if a person touches this shiny metal surface, he will get an electric shock. So I had write here that, so fuse will still blow, and a lamp would appear off. Lamp lamp appears off, and the metal case the metal case is live and can cause electric shock. So again, what will happen here, if I revise the concepts here, there is a fuse. fuse in the earth wire. The live wire touches the shiny metal surface. There is not any current now passing through the filament lamp because now the live wire becomes in contact with the uh, earth wire. So all of the current is earth. So the filament lamp will not turn on, it will not turn out, it will not turn on. All of the current will be earth, and the fuse in the earth wire will also blow away. But because the live wire is in constant touch with the earth wire, the current will still flow through it, although the fuse will try to interrupt here, but it cannot do anything here. The current will still flow to the shiny metal surface. As soon someone touches the shiny metal surface, he will get an electric shock. So that's our answer. So question number 9. So figure 9.1 shows a simple AC generator. Explain why there is a voltage induced in the coil when the coil is turned. When the coil is turned, its sides cut the magnetic field, and that's why the current is induced. That is in correspondence with the electromagnetic induction presented to us by Michael Faraday, and he says that a current is only induced when either current passes through a magnetic field or a magnetic field has some relation with the current. So I simply write here its side, the side of the coil sides cut the magnetic its sides cut the magnetic field, and in correspondence to the in correspondence to the law of electromagnetic induction, its sides cut the electric magnetic field, and that is why a current is induced in the coil. So in figure 9.1, the coil is horizontal with AB side on the left. Okay, the output voltage is 6 volts. On the figure 9.2, draw a line from the each of the shaded boxes to one of the circled voltages to show the voltage output when the coil is in different positions. One line has been drawn for you. So when the coil is horizontal with AB on the left, the current is 6 volts. So current would be negative 6 volts when the coil reaches the other side. So it would be coil horizontal on the right, it would be minus 6 volts. And when the coil reaches the vertical position, so remember this, whenever the coil reaches the vertical position, the current in its the voltage produced in it is 0 volts. So remember this. So when it is in vertical, there is 0 voltage, 0 current. So that's your answer. Part C. Both an AC generator and a DC motor contain a coil and a brushes. Figure 9.1 shows how the brushes are connected. Figure 9.1 shows how the brushes are connected to a coil in an AC generator. Draw a diagram to show how the brushes are connected to a coil in a DC motor. So it is actually a quite simple diagram here. So first of all, I will try to draw a coil here. So suppose this is the coil, and then I had draw split ring. So each one is a split ring. This is the split ring, and then you draw the brushes which are in contact with the split ring. So these are the brushes, and then you draw your power supply. Then you draw the power supply. So this is how the brushes are connected to a coil in the DC motors. State why there are forces on the sides of the coil in a DC motor. There are forces on the side of the coil in the DC motors. So first thing is that there is current and there is magnetic field. So when both interact, a magnetic force is produced. So and there is magnetic field. So both contribute to the experience of the sides of coil, experience of the magnetic force by sides of coil. First thing is that there is current and there is also a magnetic field. So they both are responsible why there are forces on the sides of the coil. They both interact. That's the reason why. That's the reason why uh, there are forces on the side of the current and the DC motor. So that's your answer. Question number 10. Carbon 14. Carbon 14 is an isotope of carbon. It undergoes radioactive decay with a half-life of 6,000 years. With half-life of 6,000 years, the age of the sample of wood is found using the carbon 14 it contains. Describe what happens during the radioactive decay. Radioactive decay, the emission from nucleus happens from nucleus happens to form more stable substances, and as a result the byproducts are the release of radioactive rays, which are the gamma rays, the alpha rays, the beta rays. So that's your answer. Part B. The count rate of the carbon 14 in the sample of wood is initially 1600 counts per minute. On figure 5 10.1, draw a diagram to show how the count rate will vary over the next 24,000 years. The initial count rate is initially marked with an X. So the half-life is 6,000 years. So in the first 6,000 years, be something like 10. So during the first 6,000 years, it would become half. Mind by drawing again. Mind by drawing. 6,000. So at 6,000 years, it would become half. It would become 400 in the next 12. It would become 400 in the next 6,000 years. It will become 200 in the next 6,000 years. That will become 18 years, 18,000 years. Here something. So yeah, yes. And in the end, in the 24,000 years, it will become even half. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It would even become half of the 200. So there would be 100 count rates at the end of the 24,000 years. You have to draw this properly. Mind by drawing again. Part C. Name the apparatus used to measure the radiation from the sample of wood and describe how it is used to measure the count rate. The apparatus used is the GM tube. You all know this. So how the apparatus which is at the GM tube is used. So now first of all the GM tube measures the number of counts at a specified time, and then we compare the count rate with the graph. So this is the graph we had initially drawn, and then this will help us to figure out the age of the sample of the wood. So we measure the count rate by the GM tube, and then we compare it with the graph we have for the count rates we have for the half-life, and then at the end we subtract the background radiations, so they should not actually be there. So that's how the GM tube is used. So I'm gonna add a box here, text box. So measures measures the number of measures the number of counts in a specified time, and then it removes, or you can say subtracts, the background radiations. So that's your answer. C, part C. mm, Describe how the count rates from a sample of wood is used to find in its age. Now I have already given to the answer to this. The how you can do this. Mm, so the answer is that you find the count rates by using the GM tube, obviously, and then you compare the count rates with the graph you initially have for the half life and the comparison of the count rates with the time, and then you can do the mathematics and find out the sample of the wood. So that's how you will do this. So again, a text box. Mm, so mhm, we measure the count rates from the wood, which is the sample of the wood, and then we compare it with the graph of count rates to time, and then calculate the age of the sample. So that's your answer. So we are moving to the last question from the astronomical physics, question number 11. So looks quite easy. Mm, Table 11.11 shows details about 8 planets in the solar system, their average distance from the sun, their orbital period, and their average surface temperature. Mm, so A, complete the table by adding the names of the 3 planets that are not given. So the closest to sun is Mars. So you can, oh sorry, Mars not, it is Mercury. It is Mercury which is closest to sun. And the anomaly here, the average surface temperature is 167. So some of you might confuse here, but this is an anomaly. It is an exception here. So first of all, it's Mercury. Then you have Venus, Earth, Mars. You have Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune. So Jupiter definitely has less distance uh, from the Sun in comparison to Uranus. So this will definitely be Jupiter here because it is closer to Sun. Uranus is at a distance. It has a greater distance from the Sun, and the temperature is again temperatures. Oh, it is minus 110. So yes, Jupiter has higher temperature. Uranus has lower temperature. So it would be Jupiter and then Uranus. Calculate the orbital speed of the Mars as it travels around the Sun. The orbital speed. So this is the Sun. So this is the Mars moving here. So the total distance it travels in an orbit would be equal to 2 pi r. The circumference of the circle is equal to 2 pi r. And the radius, the distance from the Sun is this value. And you have to find the speed. So velocity is equal to distance divided by time. So velocity is equal to 2 pi r and I divided by time. The orbital period is also given, which is 5.9 into 10 raised to power 7. So you can put the values in the calculator. I am putting it in mine. So 2 pi into 2.3 into 10 raised to power 8. You divide this by 5.9 into 10 raised to power 7. So the orbital speed is something like 24.49 kilometers per second. So obviously 25.5 kilometers per second. That's your answer. Describe the relationship between the of a planet distance from the of a planet from the sun and its orbital period. Mm, the So the relationship between the distance of the planet from the sun and its orbital period, Mercury is closest to sun. It has the lowest orbital period. Then the Venus has greater, Earth has greater, Mars has greater because it is at a greater distance from the sun, and the same trend goes on. So you can write that as the distance increases. mm, as the distance increases, the orbital the orbital period also increase. So this trend is definitely followed here. The greater the distance, the greater is the orbital period, because greater is the value of r here. The greater is the value of r here. So last part D. Describe the relationship between the distance from the sun and the average surface temperature of a planet. In your description, include any anomalies. So anomalies here are, I think it is the Mercury here. Mercury and so anomaly here is not Mercury actually. The surface temperature increases from Mercury to Venus, then it decreases again. It decreases from Earth to Mars, decreases again, decreases again, decreases, and this trend is followed. So the only anomaly here is for the Venus here. The temperature should decrease here, but temperature increases here. So you can see that uh, except from Venus, the greater is the distance of an object from the sun, the cooler it is. It has an increasing and decreasing temperature, surface temperature. The cooler it is. So this trend is followed here. So can you write the answer in your own words as well? So that's all for our today's video. Make sure to like and subscribe and press the bell icon for upcoming videos and past papers. Goodbye, good night, Allah Hafiz.